Hey, good morning, guys, or afternoon. I just wanted to uh, do this lesson on the civil rights movement, and this is just an extremely important thing that we know, and this is going to be seen by both my AP class and my regular class. Um, so even though I have it entitled Chapter 21, it is for both. And honestly, both of you guys need to just there's a lot of information here to know. As an American citizen, I think it's important to know about the civil rights movement. This is not the only thing that we're going to do to study this, yeah, but I do want to kind of give some basics. Uh, so, why did we need the civil rights movement? And in some sense, not everything is fixed, not everything is better. There still needs to be um, progress in some areas, but the question is, what was going on at the time that really caused this movement to exist, and um, why do we need it? The first thing, and I think the biggest thing to note, is segregation. America was racially segregated, particularly in the South. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case from the 1890s, late 1880s. Forgot the exact year. I think 1889. I'm not sure though. But it's a Supreme Court case that had at that point in time had been around for 50 years or more, and had really was firmly entrenched that racial segregation was not illegal. And because it wasn't illegal, laws in the South made it the law. And so these are called Jim Crow laws, and I think you know this, but Jim Crow laws were the norm in the South. And so, and it's not just in the South, but, so there's legal segregation, as in, certain stores or certain places or, seats on buses and trains were all pretty strictly racially segregated. But even all over the country, housing developments were almost always, in the 50s, as more and more housing developments grew up. These were for white people, and there was segregation when it came to that. As we've talked about, Major League Baseball was segregated. The Army, the military was segregated up until Truman desegregated. So segregation really is the big thing that the civil rights movement is trying to address. Okay. Also, voting rights. Poll taxes and literacy tests were really designed to make it difficult for black people to vote. And these aren't just necessarily basic literacy tests. These are tests that were put in place to really find a way to make it difficult to vote. And there's also just intimidation. So local governments were able to do the poll taxes, do the literacy test. They're also, the police in certain areas they're gonna turn a blind eye to someone intimidating African American from voting. And these are commonplace, especially in the South. And it was just known that if you were a black person in the South, then there's no use in voting. And people had just in some ways accepted that. And then, the kind of the bigger, but of course more difficult to specifically deal with issue is just the general racism in society. We talked about housing being usually segregated, employment and discrimination in employment, all these things. Altogether, the civil rights movement is trying to address all of these. And we'll get to kind of how that works, but yeah, that's how those are the issues that the civil rights movement is aimed at. Thank you for letting me get a drink of water. We're gonna go kind of start with Jackie Robinson. I know that people have made a big deal about in sports Jackie Robinson integrating baseball, which was the most popular sport at the time. And there's a lot that can be said about this that I don't have time to really get into. But in a lot of ways, Jackie Robinson's integration of Major League Baseball, which is done, this is a national institution that he's he's able to integrate this national institution in this very public and kind of national way. It really, in a lot of ways, is the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's the beginning of the end of segregation. Um, and a couple things to note on this. Robinson is hired by the Dodgers owner Branch Rickey and brought in really to be this guinea pig test case to push for the end of segregation. He gets Robinson not only because Robinson's a great ball player. Robinson was also an educated man. Robinson was also a devout man of faith. Robinson was also someone who cared deeply about ending racial segregation. And all these things kind of made Robinson the perfect person to, his great skill as an athlete, his faith, the perfect person to kind of be the model, to go into Major League Baseball and to endure discrimination, to endure being called names and just horrible, horrible insults, to endure all of these things and basically turn the other cheek. The whole experiment was really based on this Christian Sermon on the Mount ideal of turning the other cheek. And that's what Robinson did for years in professional baseball, to be able to prove to the world that a black man can play professional baseball, and he can do it with dignity and class, and he can do it just as well or better than other people. And that's what Robinson did. And so not only is it kind of the beginning of racial, of the beginning of desegregation, Robinson's entry into Major League Baseball is also the model for a lot of the nonviolent civil rights movement that we see in Martin Luther King Jr. Now, he's not the only thing that influences that for sure, but it does come before, and it really serves as a model. We talked about this last week. I shouldn't spend any time on this. We talked about the Dixiecrats. We talked about Strom Thurmond, and how they opposed Truman, particularly because Truman was integrating the Army. And the reason I think it would be important to bring up is, the Democratic Party was really in an interesting position when you had presidents like Truman and then later on Kennedy, who were Democrats but who were against segregation because their base was the South, and the South was staunchly, especially Southern Democrats, for segregation. And so just to kind of say, and I think I've said this before, but there's this tension in the Democratic Party between trying to hold on to the South and trying to follow, desegregation policies. Okay, so both of that's going on. And there's also this tension between the idea of states' rights, which had been a pretty staunch idea of the Democratic Party, that you give rights to states and the federal government doesn't infringe on those too much. So the idea of states' rights, which the Dixiecrats were all about, and the Democrats in general were all about. But if the federal government is going to step in and end segregation, it has to do that really at the expense of states' rights. And I think I know I've mentioned that before, but I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind, because politically, that's a big thing that's going on when it comes to the civil rights issue, the whole movement. It is this constitutional tension between states' rights and people's own individual liberties and freedoms. Well, one of the biggest things that begins the civil rights movement in the 50s is challenges in court. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and I should have a picture of Thurgood Marshall in here. I'm sorry that I don't. They really began the strategy of pushing in court, of challenging segregation. And there are lawsuits all over the place. And Thurgood Marshall was a brilliant attorney who was African American. He later on became the first African American Supreme Court justice. But he's the attorney that argues in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in 1954. And he's the attorney that really challenges so much of segregation, and eventually this gets taken to the Supreme Court. And Brown versus Board of Education is just a monumental Supreme Court decision. It is a Supreme Court decision that changes everything. It overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, which had been around for over 50 years, and it opens up the possibility, or really has the end of legal segregation. It ends the idea of you can have separate but equal facilities. So schools are being told by the federal government after this that they're going to need to integrate. So the federal government has decided that separate but equal is not equal, and there's going to be integration. And so there's a legal victory here, and a lot of the Supreme Court, a lot of the civil rights movement is taking that legal victory of Brown versus Board of Education and making it an actual victory for people in their daily life. And that becomes sometimes very difficult, as we'll see kind of from this first point, the Little Rock Nine. These are the Little Rock Nine refers to the first African American high school students who go to Little Rock, Arkansas High School, or Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is a picture of one of those students. They are 9 black students that are being treated horribly. And just imagine, I know you might be, being in quarantine and all the rest. It's definitely a different environment to imagine going to high school. But I've always, said to students in this, imagine going to high school and being one of those 9 students in that environment with all eyes on you, with literally protesters outside the high school. Literally, President Eisenhower had to send in the army to protect them. And really to do so over the governor, who was saying you're not going to integrate them, and he's like, no, we're going to send in the army. They have a right to go in and to enforce the Supreme Court decision, to stay consistent with the Supreme Court decision. And so they go to high school, and after they integrate, actually, the governor of Arkansas shut down all the high schools in Arkansas. And I believe it was for a year that there were no public high schools in Arkansas after they were forced to integrate. You think these issues were huge and really affected everyday life. Here's just another picture of it, of protesters outside, protesting what they called race mixing, and these signs that say race mixing is communism, which I think is like the most 1950s thing anyone could ever say. But just if you want to call something bad, call it communist. So here, that's a picture to kind of go along with that. Hey, I like this picture of Rosa Parks because it's what we know her for, her arrest. But one thing that people don't know is Rosa Parks was not just a random person. This was the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm sorry. Let me look up the date. 55. Okay. The Montgomery bus boycott was... hold on. Let me go back to Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a civil rights advocate. She was someone who had been involved in the movement and the cause before. So she's not just a random person that decides, hey, I'm not going to give up my seat. I'm not going to move back on the bus. She is someone who's doing it for a purpose. And she, kind of like Jackie Robinson, he was really chosen for a reason, as kind of this first case, because they knew that he could probably endure it. And Rosa Parks is chosen for a reason because it, you know, to force a woman out of her seat is different than forcing a man out of his seat. Um, there's, it gets to some other issues like, chivalry. Um, and, she, by, when this happens and when she is forced and arrested for not giving up her seat, there was a bus boycott that's led by Martin Luther King Jr. right after this. And so this was kind of a coordinated effort. It wasn't just an accident, but it was a way to, and I want you to think, there's a lot of these things going on in the civil rights movement, and this is really the first big one, a way to challenge the system publicly. And so we're going to do this. You're going to force an arrest of a totally innocent, upstanding woman, and just, makes you look bad for arresting this woman for what, not giving up her seat. It's absurd. Why? Just because she's black? The what they're doing is trying to make the people who believe in segregation, who are trying to uphold segregation, they're trying to make them look bad, and they're trying to point out the what's wrong with it. Now that's really the whole point of what Martin Luther King Jr. is doing, and so they have a boycott. They stop taking the buses, and the reality was that Montgomery is a city that has a large percentage of African Americans, and a large percentage of them at the time rode buses, and so really the whole bus system is becomes kind of obsolete without these people taking the buses, and people are sacrificing and walking to work, and it's a really well coordinated effort. I do want you to know a couple. I have some acronyms there. Martin Luther King Jr. was his group was known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it is a group of ministers. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist pastor. His father was a Baptist pastor in Atlanta, and a lot of the thought and a lot of the energy of the civil rights movement came from churches, particularly African American churches. And that's obvious with Martin Luther King Jr., but it's not the only one. I also want you to know a group that was associated with him at first, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there, the idea of nonviolence was big at this time, that in all these instances where they're standing up to what's going on, they are taking this mentality of nonviolence. We'll get to that in just a second. Well, I'll get to it now. Martin Luther King Jr. was, as a pastor, of course, is influenced very much by, the Sermon on the Mount and ideas of turning the other cheek, and Christian teachings on race and the equality of all people before God, as well as the tactics of nonviolence and not lashing out in violence. He's also influenced, and he had some associates that went to India to see Gandhi. He was influenced heavily by Gandhi, and Gandhi's ideas, and Gandhi led a revolution and gained independence for India with nonviolent means. And things like, if you may remember in world history, the Salt March and these kinds of protests. And the whole idea behind these nonviolent civil disobedience, strategies, the whole idea behind that strategy is to defy a law that is unjust, to do it publicly, and to force the other side to maybe even take violence, to make them, to show that they are morally wrong in this. That's really the whole idea behind it. And sit-ins are a great example. So sit-ins begin with college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, and these sit-ins are fairly simple. You get a group of people together, and they go to a lunch counter. And in Greensboro, it was at a store that had a lunch counter called the Woolworths, and they sat there and they ordered lunch, and go in there and order a hamburger and fries or whatever, and you're told by the person behind the counter, you're not supposed to be here. Why? Well, because you're black. And they would just insist calmly and quietly, well, I would like lunch, please. And they were, usually arrested. People in the community would sometimes just get up and push them, shove them, beat them, curse at them, certainly use racial slurs. And it was just, and why? Because they're ordering lunch. And so you see, it really puts that other side, the people enforcing segregation, to be in this position that where you're willing to just to degrade another person, you're willing to hurt them, you're willing to drag them off, and what are they doing? They're ordering lunch, right? As some, ordering a cup of coffee or whatever it might be, and that's what's going on with the sit-ins in Greensboro, and the sit-ins that come all over, and Nashville and Atlanta, all over the South. But Greensboro, North Carolina, is the site of some of the earliest and most important sit-ins. There's a picture, as you know, of Martin Luther King Jr. We're going through this quick. You guys will watch videos and learn more. But the Freedom Riders, these are just absolutely. These are some of the most interesting things for me to study, because before I was a history teacher, I really didn't know much about these. A lot of them were coordinated in Nashville, where I went to college, and I didn't even learn about these then. But they were coordinated a lot of times by a lady named Diane Nash, who you're going to learn about in the videos. Diane Nash coordinated. She's a college student in Nashville, Tennessee. I think 20 years old, 19 years old, just young lady. And what they did was the Greyhound buses and the other buses, I think Trailways was the other company. These buses were not segregated because they're national companies, and they were trying to comply with the Supreme Court ruling that ended segregation. But when they'd go down to southern cities, when they'd go to Atlanta, when they'd go to Montgomery, when they'd go to places in Alabama and Birmingham and everything else, they were segregated. And so they'd get off the bus, and they would go around basically defying segregation laws. And the Freedom Rider groups were usually a mixed group of people. They were black and white, and they would travel together, and so they'd go together to restaurants and places in these cities defying segregation laws. And it is they're purposefully defying the laws because they view them as unjust, and it is just frightening to see what people did to them. You're going to watch videos, but I mean, one of these buses, someone puts a bomb in it and blows it up, and it is just absolutely astonishing. This what happens in just this event in American history. But as you see, with sit-ins, with marches, with boycotts, with freedom rides, these are all ways to defy segregation, and in none of them are people doing it by violent means. The whole idea behind all of this kind of tactic is nonviolence. And although it wasn't 100% coordinated, Martin Luther King Jr. is kind of central and influential in all of these efforts. One of King's most famous campaigns was in Birmingham, to march in Birmingham and to just defy segregation in Birmingham, because Birmingham was the most segregated city in America. So King from Atlanta comes over to Birmingham, brings a bunch of people with him to defy segregation. But there's a reason why Birmingham is chosen. like we said, it is the most segregated city in America, and their police chief, Bull Connor, was an idiot, and they knew he would overreact. They knew, and this is kind of hard to wrap your head around in a way. They knew that he would do terribly awful racist stuff that would be on the news, and to make the side of ending segregation, the civil rights side, look good, and the other side, the side supporting segregation, look bad. That's exactly why they went to Birmingham. They knew that he would give them kind of fodder for the cameras, and it's in Birmingham where there's there's a picture of the police opening up the fire hose and just spraying kids, just brutally. So Birmingham campaign was a famous one. And you guys know at least a little bit about the March on Washington, just to kind of give you some details of it. The March on Washington was a march designed to support Kennedy's civil rights bill. And it's really something to kind of push the country into adopting a civil rights bill that's going to end segregation. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. makes his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We're going to get to actually King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I should have mentioned when we talked about Birmingham. We're going to get to that in a different time. And the "I Have a Dream" speech. The text of those things we'll be looking at this week, but this is where that speech is made, and the result is, even though Kennedy's assassinated, the result is the Civil Rights Act does pass in 1964 under President Johnson, and so that is just a great, kind of the crowning achievement in a lot of ways of the civil rights movement. Another issue that we're not going to spend as much time on is voting, as I mentioned, ways to keep people away from the polls, poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation. 90% of African Americans did not vote. So 90% of African Americans had really no political power at all, or political voice. And so it's groups like the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that and Martin Luther King is involved in this, and campaigns known as Freedom Summer. And the term freedom, and you're going to see this in his "I Have a Dream" speech, using freedom as more than just freedom from slavery, but really, equality and the end of segregation. Freedom becomes more than just not being a slave, right? Freedom means something more. It means, in this case, having rights and being able to vote. And so the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee goes around and registers a ton of people to vote, and is trying to get African Americans to, rock the vote. And the reality is that in so many places in the South, so many local governments, there is a black majority, and there's a real possibility for African Americans to have some political power in places in the South if they could vote. But the government as a whole in the South, or the government of the states as a whole in the South, really didn't want to let that happen. Selma becomes kind of the center of, of the voting rights campaign. And Selma's an area that does have a black majority, but only 3% of that black majority is registered to vote. When there is a march in Selma, there is violence done to the people marching. The people marching are not acting in violence, but violence is done to them. But despite, and even maybe because of the way people are treated with violence in all these marches and campaigns, maybe even because of that, is what makes national attention, and what really turns there's a kind of a revolution, a moral revolution going on in America, to where people are opening up their eyes and saying, this is wrong, and I need to support policies that have desegregation or that promote voting rights. And so the Voting Rights Act passes in 1965. And so it's another direct result of Martin Luther King Jr.'s work and the Selma campaign. The sad reality of the civil rights movement is that things don't just get better after those things. There's these two amazing achievements in law, and there really is improvement in a lot of ways. And we didn't mention things, about schools being like colleges being desegregated. You have some major high profile people like James Meredith becoming a student at University of Mississippi. I forgot the person who was the first black student in Alabama, but these places also becoming desegregated. But the other problem of just societal racism does not go away. Certainly does not go away quickly. You start seeing, after years and years of the civil rights movement and being met with violence and people being told not to strike back, you start seeing plenty of people using violent means, and you start seeing urban violence. Between 1964 and 1968, there are 100 race riots. One of those in outside of Los Angeles in Watts is one of the biggest race riots we have in this country. So it's not just in the South. Race riots and these problems, actually a lot of the race riots are in the northern cities, as well as in the West as well. So things don't just get magically better. And there is, and it's hard to really pinpoint, but there is this kind of turning point in the civil rights movement. Some of it doesn't entirely come when Martin Luther King's assassinated in I think 1968. I think it's 68. But there is this turning, but that probably, certainly contributes to it. But there's this turning point as we get into the late 60s after the Voting Rights Act is passed. There's so much momentum for the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement kind of, the momentum dies down, but some more radical groups take it in different directions. And you start seeing the turning point to where things become less of this Christian nonviolent effort and more of a radical kind of nationalism. You start seeing that nationalist groups, the Nation of Islam is a sort of a black Muslim group that was, they're nationalists, black nationalists, as in they promote Islam over Christianity because they see Islam as an African religion. It's not. And Islam enslaved a lot of Africans, but they kind of ignore that and see Islam as a African religion. And it promotes this sort of different identity, that we are different. It's a whole different narrative than Martin Luther King Jr. that was saying, we should all be together, that my children should be able to play with white children and, go to Disneyland or whatever it might be. Whereas the black nationalist groups and the Nation of Islam are promoting difference and, in some ways superiority, that the white people are evil and we're better. So it's a pretty big difference in mentality. Now, Malcolm X was, at least for a while, part of that group. And he just clearly rejects this whole nonviolent attitude toward civil rights that Martin Luther King Jr. has. This doesn't mean that Malcolm X is going around telling everyone they need to kill all the white people. He's not necessarily I don't know of any criminal, where he went around actually attacking people. I don't know Malcolm X super well. But the mentality is that, we shouldn't have to be nonviolent to gain our rights. We should be able to stand up for ourselves. And even promoting, like I said, this black superiority. And so these there's clearly a different mentality here than we saw with Martin Luther King Jr. And we'll study more of Martin Luther King Jr. and kind of get into that mentality. But as you watch the videos and stuff that you're going to watch, you're going to see kind of that different mentality. And just to know a few of these names, like Stokely Carmichael, a leader of the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, which were basically black communist radicals as well, promoting an overthrow of society. So this is, you have all these splinter groups that come out of the civil rights movement that really do have a very different message. And Martin Luther King Jr., when he was alive, was really adamant that this is not the way we should be doing things. But he didn't have control over the movement. It wasn't just his. It was a much larger movement, and that's one, something that he couldn't completely control. But you do sort of see, I think the big picture is, you do sort of see the civil rights movement gaining in momentum, and then breaking off and becoming more radical in not a very positive way. Just lastly, I'll give you a few terms that are in the text that I would be familiar with that you may not know. One is, this is kind of the end of the civil rights movement, but currently we have affirmative action laws in place. And affirmative action basically actually is the federal government promoting laws and hiring and things like that will actually try to fix racial discrimination by promoting people of color. And there's a lot of debate on whether or not this works, or how much it's even instituted, but I do want you to know that term. And then kind of a difference between these two things: de facto segregation and de jure segregation. De facto is segregation just by custom, whereas de jure segregation means segregation by law. So the civil rights movement really did end de jure segregation. Jim Crow laws were abolished, legal segregation was over, but it doesn't mean that it ended de facto segregation. And as a lot of people point out, every Sunday in the South, a lot of people go to church, and it's probably the most segregated day of the week, right? Because you have black churches and you have white churches. But that's not just in the South. You have neighborhoods all over the country where you have black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. California is somewhat an exception to this, but that sort of de facto segregation is really all over the country, particularly in the Midwest, Northeast and the Southeast. And so, you can kind of debate the extent that that's a problem, but certainly it's a reality in the country. I know this was really big overview, and we skipped a lot of stuff. You're going to study this more, but I wanted to kind of throw out terms that you need to know, people that you need to know, ideas that you need to know, and kind of give you a big, broad overview of the civil rights movement. I wish we could be in class in person together, because I love this unit, and I love talking about it and getting to watch documentaries and speeches and reading. But that's not the case. So anyway, it is what it is. God bless.